Well, the contractor has started tearing down 33 buildings here in the Elkmont Historic District, and this demolition marks the punctuation of a 25-year bitter fight over what to do with these old vacation cabins that were here before this was even a national park. Join us for a series we're calling Elkmont Will Shine. We'll go in-depth with rare film, home movies, and documents that show why some people are still so bitter about this situation. But first, we want to just give you a lay of the land here at Elkmont and show you the work that's been going on since 1992. This map shows 70 buildings at the Elkmont Historic District in 1992. You can break them down into 4 neighborhoods. First, you have the Wonderland Club with 12 buildings, including the Wonderland Hotel. Head over to the Little River Trail and there's Millionaire's Row with 10 buildings. Just beside it, where the road loops around, Daisytown has 22 buildings. Then there is Society Hill with 26 buildings running along Jakes Creek. And at the end of 1992, when the leases ran out on these cabins and the hotel, the park was going to tear down everything. But then the cabins were listed on the National Register of Historic Places, so the park had to reconsider and spent a decade and a half figuring out what to do. In the meantime, the empty buildings were vandalized and fell apart, including the Wonderland Hotel, so the park tore it down in 2006. Finally, in 2009, the park adopted an official plan: restore 19 buildings shown in yellow and tear down the rest. But it only had the money to do a little bit of work at a time, so it started by getting rid of 4 cabins in Daisytown, building new parking lots, and restoring the old Appalachian Clubhouse in 2011. In 2012, crews finished rebuilding the Spence cabin and a new parking area. Then the project went back on hold, waited for money, and in 2016, a fire destroyed the annex of the Wonderland Hotel. The project picked back up again in 2017 with money to restore 4 cabins in Daisytown and also tear down 33 of the buildings on Millionaire's Row and Society Hill. After this round of work, the to-do list to finally finish this project will include tearing down 12 cabins and restoring 13 others. The end result, 19 cabins. 2 of them you can rent during the day for events. The rest, empty museum exhibits for a small glimpse of the history in the Elkmont Historic District.
Crews are tearing down dozens of historic cabins in Elkmont, a milestone in a long, controversial project in the Smokies. And all this week, we are taking an in-depth look at Elkmont's past and future. WBIR 10 News reporter Jim Matheny begins our series, Elkmont Will Shine.
A deadline for demolition looms in Elkmont. A final chance for pictures of a ghost town before it vanishes. These old vacation cabins look more like the remnants of a war zone. There was a battle here.
So I look at these pictures and I look at the cabins now, and it kind of hurts my heart to see what they look like now.
For Lynn Faust, the fight may be over, but the emotional wounds have not healed. She grew up coming to Elkmont, and so did her children at their family cabin along Little River Trail.
Just many good times here, many good times.
Today, Faust is known as the world's leading expert on lightning bugs. And that scientific journey began on this back porch, where she discovered the rare synchronous fireflies that now attract sold-out crowds to Elkmont. But for decades, this display was just a family tradition her mother-in-law called the light show.
In those days, it was not well known. In fact, we all just watched it and appreciated it, but we knew it was beautiful what we were watching.
The private shows on the back porch ended in 1992, when the leases on these cabins and the Wonderland Hotel expired. People had to leave, and the park was going to tear everything down.
Once history is destroyed, it's gone forever.
So a bitter battle began to preserve a piece of the past that created the present Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
To save Elkmont and the story it has to tell.
In the early 1900s, Elkmont really boomed when the Little River Lumber Company laid tracks across the mountain to harvest a treasure of tall timber.
by early 1900s, Elkmont was the second largest town in Sevier County.
The train opened direct access for logging and for travel. Knoxville's elite took the train for fun weekend trips in the once secluded wilderness. They formed the private Appalachian Club, built a clubhouse, and more than 70 vacation cottages.
And so people would get on the logging train and ride up and get in the cool mountain air.
We used to call it hillbilly air conditioning. You know, you go to the mountains for the summer to cool off.
Just next door, the new Wonderland Club Hotel gave the rest of the public a place to enjoy the same rarefied air of Elkmont.
So at that time, you saw that first glimmer of early tourism.
Here's the beautiful Elkmont country brochure from 1915 trying to get people to come to the Smokies.
And as logging companies clear-cut the trees and eventually started to clear out, leaders in Elkmont wanted to save the scenery of the Smokies by making it a national park.
Many of the people of the Elkmont resort community were some of the first park advocates.
And fascinating stories of the fights that took place at the Appalachian Club on where to put the park. All of that was hammered out in Elkmont.
In 1934, the Great Smoky Mountains officially became a national park. The government was so grateful to David Chapman for his help, it gave him a cabin at Elkmont. But ironically, by creating the park, these people would have to give up their cabins. Just not immediately. The government gave almost everyone in the park a choice. Sell your property for full price and leave immediately, or sell for a discount and you can get a lifetime lease and stay here until you die. In Elkmont, a lifetime lease made sense.
To get to use it longer was much more valuable to somebody where it was their summer cabin.
Resentment grew among families who had to take the money and leave their homes behind, while the well-to-do could afford to stay.
Some people have felt that people here had a financial advantage, so there were hard feelings.
Hard feelings or not, the people in Elkmont were here for life. Elkmont was full of happy campers, a Wonderland hotel, and family cabins where a tight-knit community sang into the night. Elkmont will shine. For WBIR 10 News, I'm Jim Matheny.
The people in Elkmont helped create the national park and then had a lifetime lease to keep their cabins until they died. WBIR 10 News reporter Jim Matheny shows us how that agreement became a lot more complicated in part 2 of Elkmont Will Shine.
When the Great Smoky Mountains became a national park, cabin owners here sold to the government cheap in exchange for a lifetime lease for them and their children. But in the early 1950s, this cut-and-dry arrangement got a lot more complicated because they wanted electricity. The utility company said it needed a 20-year guarantee the cabins would still be here to make it worth installing.
So instead of being based on anyone's particular life, they said, okay, this will give us a time certain to amortize the investment of running electricity in there.
So almost everyone changed their lease to expire in 20 years, 1972. That was extended again through the end of 1992. In the meantime, life went on as usual. Visitors enjoyed mountain air and country cooking at the Wonderland Hotel.
And the hot chocolate and biscuits. Take your hot chocolate out on that porch and rock in the chairs and look at Blanket Mountain.
And people from all around the country rolled into a new campground in Elkmont that opened in 1961. But not everyone here was a visitor. Some old-timers lived here permanently, like J.T. Higdon, who made a living taking care of the cabins.
You're the caretaker here?
Have been for about 30 years.
30 years. How many people live up here now?
Been year-round?
Yeah.
Me and my sister and the Rangers.
J.T. Higdon, who some of my fondest memories are listening to him sing Elkmont Will Shine at the end of every party.
In 1982, the park made it clear. No Elkmont leases would be extended again.
Everyone signed an agreement that said, we understand when the leases run out, that all the structures would be taken out. That was what was in the general management plan.
Some tried to get another extension to keep their cabins.
We're trying to preserve historic Elkmont.
Others accepted they would have to leave, but wanted the park to open their cabins up to the public, not tear them down.
Just whether I was going to be there or not, I was sorry the history of it, that was dying along with it. When something's torn down, it's gone.
But there was another side that felt just as strong. Environmental groups wanted the cabins gone to return this land to nature. There was also bitterness from people who had to leave the park decades ago. They wanted this private enclave of Elkmont erased.
Many of the early park descendants that left during the park's creation felt that these lease arrangements were a slap in the face for what they went through vacating the park.
It was a totally polarized situation.
Elkmont will shine forever.
Some cabin holders held out hope.
Dad, hey Pixie.
But also prepared to say goodbye, documenting their dear community before it was demolished.
That's a Matthews cabin.
They had big parties and sang a familiar tune.
We had all cried and kissed it goodbye in 1992.
When the leases expired, the people of Elkmont begged to at least let J.T. Higdon stay. He lived here almost his whole life. He was practically blind, and they would pay for all of his expenses. The park made no exceptions. J.T. and his sister Midge were loaded up, driven out, away from their home and their way of life. J.T. Higdon died 4 years later. The end of Elkmont seemed certain. But soon there was a twist that would lead to another long fight over the historic value of Elkmont.
There's a story that needs to be told. We all need to understand this park didn't just fall out of heaven.
For WBIR 10 News, I'm Jim Matheny.
Fascinating. And how about this? We have maps and photos of every cabin in Elkmont, what they look like in the past, what they look like today. You can check out those galleries on our Facebook page as well as WBIR.com.
We continue our week-long look at the past and future of historic Elkmont. The people there lobbied to create the national park and were able to keep their cabins until 1992.
But a new fight over the buildings was just getting started. WBIR 10 News reporter Jim Matheny shows us the negotiations and neglect in part 3 of Elkmont Will Shine.
At the end of 1992, the leases expired for almost everyone in Elkmont, and the park had a clear plan. Demolish all 70 buildings that were here before the Great Smoky Mountains became a national park.
They were built in the 1910s. At the time of the park's establishment in 1934, these would not have been considered historic.
The Park Service also argued the buildings here were always temporary.
Many of them have just these very simple rock foundations. Even the Wonderland Hotel was built only on stacked stone.
While the cabins had wear and tear, photos in 1992 show they were in good shape. But they were doomed nonetheless.
In 1992, we were told the cabins would come down in 6 weeks.
Then in 1994, the cabins and the Wonderland Hotel got a lifeline when they were put on the National Register of Historic Places, and the park had to reconsider its plan.
And everybody went, "You're kidding."
With the future of the cabins up in the air, Faust and other families wanted to pay to keep their old buildings in top shape until a decision was made. The park said no.
Demolition by neglect was allowed to occur. If a tree falls on it, makes a hole in the roof, no one does anything. It was heartbreaking watching a structure that had been loved and cared for just falling into decay.
Some accused the park of stalling to let the buildings fall apart, so the only choice would be to remove them. But the park was actually weighing several options and letting the public chime in.
There was a pretty direct conflict.
Those cabins have no historical significance at all. They should be removed.
I would like to see that whole community preserved.
It should be for everybody to go.
We're in favor of the most natural solution, us fireflies, which would be remove the cabins and restore the native plant life.
The Park Service cannot get enough money up to rebuild them, and if it could, it would be a waste of money.
While the public argument centered on money, documents show funding was really not the issue. A study paid for by the park said operating these cabins like LeCotte Lodge would quickly pay for itself.
The money would be repaid within 5 years. Money was never really a problem. Very clear offers from local philanthropists to save Elkmont and the Wonderland Hotel for public use.
That includes an offer never reported. In 2001, Sandy Bell, the founder of Ruby Tuesday and Blackberry Farm, one of the highest rated resorts in the country, offered to renovate and operate the Wonderland Hotel. Bell's letter says he would invest up to $15 million, would sign a long-term lease, make sure the environment was not damaged, and share the profits with the Park Service. The project would be done in 2 years and save history without costing the park. Bell's offer was ignored. The park never opened up any commercial bids because it said that type of operation needed to be two things: appropriate and necessary. Lodging may be appropriate enough, but it was not necessary, with so many places to stay in nearby cities.
At the time the park was created, one of the things that the park leadership did intentionally was not to build grand lodges inside the national park because they wanted to provide some benefit from the tourism for our local communities.
Ultimately, the Park Service came up with 7 different options for Elkmont that ranged from saving all the buildings, saving some, or tearing everything down. Meanwhile, the cabins were vandalized.
People come in and trash it.
That make you sad, kind of?
Make me mad.
And part of the Wonderland Hotel collapsed. So in 2006, crews tore it down. After years of delays and decay, the park was about to finally announce its decision on Elkmont, knowing whatever the choice, at least one side, and maybe all sides, would not be happy. For WBIR 10 News, I'm Jim Matheny.
That neighborhood has a tremendous history in the Great Smoky Mountains, much of it spent tied up in a bitter and controversial debate.
In part 4 of our series, WBIR 10 News reporter Jim Matheny shows us how the park tried to settle the fight with a compromise.
The National Park studied and debated options at Elkmont for a decade and a half, while the buildings sat empty, were vandalized, and dissolved, waiting for a decision.
As the years passed, you kind of started assuming nothing would ever be done.
Lynn Faust and thousands of others lobbied to restore the cabins, saying the best way to get people to care about and preserve them is to use them.
To spend the night in the park, that's very different than driving in your car and hiking for a couple of hours and leaving. When you get to spend the night and see the little animals that creep out in the dark, maybe watch the lightning bugs begin, wake up to the early morning sounds, it changes you in fundamental and positive ways.
Others felt just as strongly the best way to enjoy nature in Elkmont is to remove the cabins and let nature take over.
The lesson that you learned from Elkmont is that there were no bad guys. They were all doing it for the right reason.
Don Barger with the National Parks Conservation Association says Elkmont's future was torn between a mandate to preserve nature and another to preserve history.
The Park Service, they weren't on one side or the other. They were essentially trying to figure out what's the best resolution.
And the park had a change of heart about the value of Elkmont's past.
There was a perception in the park for many years that the only real history here was about the pioneers, the people who built log cabins. I think we recognized over the years that the recreational use of this area as weekend retreats was kind of a sidebar to that history.
I mean, once you answered the basic question, yeah, this is a story we want to tell. You can't just get by with foundations and photographs.
In 2006, the park announced its choice for these 70 buildings. A compromise nobody was asking for. Restore 19 buildings shown in yellow and tear down the rest, but not let anyone spend the night in them.
The Park Service was trying to essentially thread the needle.
And at the end of the day, neither side got what they wanted in its entirety. But we feel like this is the best balance.
The end result, 19 cabins. 2 of them you can rent during the day for events. The rest, empty museum exhibits.
And it does tell a very unique piece of that early park creation story and early tourism.
The choice was made, but the park said it could only afford to chip away at this project a little bit at a time. By 2012, crews had removed 4 cabins in Daisytown, put in new parking lots, and restored the 2 places you can rent during the day, Spence Cabin and the Appalachian Clubhouse.
The only thing that's different is instead of having real wood-burning fireplaces, they're now propane. People have a lot of different gatherings, lots of weddings here, and really have some nice events.
Elkmont will shine tonight, Elkmont will shine.
While seeing the clubhouse saved was something to sing about, Faust is still critical of how the park is doing the job. The cabins continue to rot while the park waits for funding. Then the buildings are pulverized and hauled off to the same place the Wonderland Hotel ended up, the Sevier County landfill. Faust says that's throwing money away because the old cabins have materials that could help pay for the whole project. The buildings are full of hardwoods and American chestnut, a rare and valuable lumber.
As a taxpayer, that bothers me. A treasure that will never be replaced.
The years of waiting make any option more expensive. It costs more to fix up a cabin as it decays. Letting them rot also means there are less valuable materials inside. But the Park Service says it's done its job.
And I can tell you that our crews feel like they have removed what was salvageable and usable.
That includes doors, hardware, and windows that all benefit the buildings that will be saved. Those materials are ready as crews take the biggest step yet towards finishing this prolonged project in historic Elkmont. For WBIR 10 News, I'm Jim Matheny.
Well, the fight over what to do with the buildings at Elkmont ended a decade ago, but those emotions are still raw.
Especially right now as dozens of the historic family cabins are finally torn down. WBIR 10 News reporter Jim Matheny shows us the final farewell and future of the historic community and the conclusion of our series, Elkmont Will Shine.
It's heartbreaking.
Lynn Faust visits a dying family member for one last time.
This cabin has been called Spring Cottage for close to 100 years because there's a spring that's beautiful, and that was our drinking water up until the 70s.
Spring Cottage is on its last legs, but leaves a lasting legacy of illumination in Elkmont.
It was from here that we first watched what was later to become the famous light show, which is the synchronous lightning bug display.
Faust is now the leading expert on lightning bugs in the world. The cabin that sparked her interest in these beaconing beetles is one of 33 demolished by the National Park in 2017. But 4 cabins are also being restored in Daisytown.
So this is the Mayo Servants Cabin, and it's been preserved. Every piece of glass of these windows was used from salvaged materials from the other cabins.
When this round of work is done, next year the park will still need funding to finish its to-do list. 13 cabins will need to be restored. 12 others left standing will wait their turn to be torn down. One need only look at the lawn of the old Wonderland Hotel in 1992 from the same angle today to know how rapidly nature reaches out.
So the forest will reclaim it and it will disappear.
After 25 years of arguing to save the cabins for public lodging and watching them slowly die in the process, heavy equipment finally prepares to put Spring Cottage out of its misery, but delivers no comfort to Faust.
And yes, it has been like losing a loved one for the past 25 years, but it's gone on so long now we're almost fond of the decaying relatives.
Since 1934, this day was inevitable. The cabins belonged to leaders who created the national park and kept their cabins with a lifetime lease, knowing their beloved community would end in someone's lifetime.
The problem with that is we all have families. We have children, we have grandchildren, and they become attached to the place the same way that we were. And so a life estate doesn't actually prevent the sense of separation, it just delays it. There has to be an end point, but it doesn't make it less painful.
While Faust and other families may consider demolition a defeat, the victories here are undeniable. Without their decades of determination, all of these buildings and the story they share would have disappeared.
I guess there's a little bit of solace that a few empty shells of cabins will remain.
And the restoration and rentals of the Appalachian Clubhouse and Spence Cabin mean more than a century of romance will continue to burn bright here. As others exchange vows and develop a deep love for this destination. And the sense of loss comes with the good fortune to have ever lived and loved this land. So Faust bids farewell with love notes on lumber and apologies to Spring Cottage. The sentimental send-off even touches the rugged crew members who tear this place apart. You hear them speaking sweetly of the swan song during the breaks in demolition.
Elkmont touches everybody, and I just don't want Elkmont to be forgotten or for people in the future to think Elkmont is just those 18 structures when there was an entire huge community, but most will simply never know. They will never know that something very important was here.
A community with a story of train tracks, timber, and the creation of the most visited national park in the country. Spring Cottage may be gone, but no apologies are needed. Faust and others already saved Elkmont. In the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Jim Matheny, WBIR 10 News.